digital drawing and painting. Welcome to a video about how to create textures using Adobe Photoshop. So, yay, welcome. We're going to talk about texture today. And with texture, it is all about the surface quality in a work of art. I am going to specifically talk about implied textures because those are textures created to look real. So they're not actual textures we can feel. These are ones that artists create in drawings and paintings to make objects look more realistic. So when you apply texture to your digital paintings, it will start to give this sense of realness in the objects. So let's get going here. With texture in Adobe Photoshop, the really big thing here is that the brushes that you use basically help you apply textures. So if we were painting physically with pencils, you have to create the illusion by using different drawing methods. But the cool thing about Adobe Photoshop is there are brushes to help us apply texture. That's the big thing to remember here. In this video, I'm going to go through textures for the iPad and then textures on the desktop. I will put giant disclaimer here. The desktop version has so many different brushes and different textures, whereas the iPad version only has a few, but they both have really nice qualities. So let's dive into our iPad textures here. So I just started to apply and make some already. The text that I put next to the little swatch of color is the name of the brush. So in Adobe Photoshop on the iPad, there are so many different types of brushes. I'm just scrolling through here to find some different ones. The first one I want to talk about is the Add Paper texture, and that's this guy here. With the Add Paper texture, what I did to create these kind of like almost clouds is lay down an indigo layer, and then on that same layer I changed the opacity of my brush by making it a little bit lighter and then adding on another pass-by on that. When you are playing around with brushes, totally test it out on a document. Like what I have here is a whole file just for testing out textures. So with the Add Paper texture, I just drew a tree on another layer using the hard round brush. And what I'm going to do here is use the Add Paper texture to give this tree some realistic qualities here. And that nice, almost tree-like texture. So I'm going to select that brush. I'm going to change my color to, let's try that brown. So if I don't like it, I can always use the back button and retry. I'm also going to change the opacity so it's just a little lighter. Maybe I don't want to use it so much. And then I'm just going to test my brush. That's pretty good size. So undo. I'm going to make it just a tad bit darker. So now that I'm ready to apply texture onto this layer of a tree already, I'm doing this in a whole new layer. And I'll show you the reason why in just a little bit. And I'm going in one swing by to add this over. If I didn't like it, boom, simple as one undo. I did not like that. I want it to be darker. So, yes, that is what I want. So this is all, I'm just pressing down once and going past everything. You're probably wondering why I'm going outside the lines, and I will show you in a little bit. But once I have that one pass by, if I go past again, it's going to make it darker. If I want that perfect, I'll keep it. maybe I want it in one spot of the tree, I could go back and add that in the one spot. One more time is going to make it just a little bit darker. So now that I have the texture applied over it, to clean up my lines and my details of just that texture I applied, I'm going to zoom in and I'm going to erase as close as I can to the tree. Because I'm going to show you an example up here. If I erase this spot and I start to go into the tree, it's not erasing the tree. It's just erasing the texture I applied over it. So something important to keep in mind as you're cleaning that up. So the brush here is applied over the hard round just to give kind of this almost bark and tree-like texture over that. So that's just one idea here. I'm going to just use my move tool on that. 2 fingers to move to the oil background mix. So this is another type of brush. Just played around with like how I maybe could make a really simple grass, like a field. Used some different swatches of green, and then I tried out blue for maybe possibly water. Really when it comes down to here, it's just playing around with those brushes. The crosshatcher brush creates all these nifty little lines of crosshatching like we would see in physical drawing. And the more I built the brush up, the more detail I got there. Lastly, the really, really cool one that I wanted to talk about, the landscaper brush, which if I click the brush, it's just towards the bottom here, creates a really nice, almost splatter, dirt-like texture. Hence the name landscaper. What I did here is I applied a hard round, so HR, hard round brush, and then over the top of it, I put the landscaper. So I could do that one more time. Then I used my eraser tool to clean up that path. So maybe that path was just in one layer. Now I can clean off the detail that was around that. So that's kind of the cool part about working in the layers. The green grass that's next to the path, I used the crosshatcher brush, and below it I applied one of the many watercolor brushes. There's the watercolor dragger, watercolor soft, watercolor. I used a watercolor flat, which I'm going to just show this real quick with blue. But I didn't like the way that turned out. I want a bigger brush. Gorgeous. And then on top of my watercolor, I used the crosshatcher in a slightly darker version of that color to go over, and that's how I build up that grass. So here if I wanted bluegrass, because why not? The more I build it up, the more those layers start to fill in. But if I just go across one time in a space, I get this really nice cross-hatching happening. What I recommend for those who are working on an iPad, make a file just like I did here to try out some different textures. So I just named this test textures and then just played around with a few different brushes. Honestly, there are so many different textures you can get from all of these different brushes. So really just playing around with them on a document, see what happens when you build up the different layers. So that is it for what I wanted to talk about on the iPad. In the next part of this video, I'm going to go over textures using those brushes on the desktop version of Adobe Photoshop. So stay tuned because that's coming up next. So now that we've talked about how to create some different textures on the iPad, I want to go over some things on the desktop version of Adobe Photoshop. So the brushes, there are a lot more on the desktop version. So if I click on my brush tool here, and I'm going to make this menu a little bit bigger so we can see here. There are different folders of brushes. I'd like to just have them all drop down at the same time so I can just go through them nicely. Your general brushes, I'd say the hard round is a really nice, just flat color base that you can add in. In the dry media brushes, you're going to see a lot of brushes from Kyle. He was one of the artists that we had in our artwork analysis assignments. He actually started his career by making different brushes for Photoshop. And then some wet media brushes also made and designed by Kyle. With the different brushes, you're going to see a small little icon next to it, and it's going to tell you what that's used for. So like Kyle's concept brush all-purpose blend smudge tool, just used for the smudge tool. So on the desktop it's a little bit more specific here. When you're using the different brushes, along the top here it will start to have the brushes that you used as you were creating. So one of my favorite brushes in the desktop version is Kyle's Foliage Mix. So with Kyle's foliage brush, I'm going to just go into my layer here where I was trying that brush out. I am, for the sake of this, we're just going to make purple leaves. Why not? This is before our fantasy unit anyways. So with that brush, the bigger the size, come back here, the bigger leaves I'm going to get. If I just press it once, it's going to start going in different directions. And that's how the brush is programmed to work as a stamp. If I make it a little bit lighter and go past, let's go lighter, it should start to blend those colors together. So if I go into my green, it's going to start to blend them together because the brush also acts as a blender too. So why not? Let's just go over that a little bit. So the foliage brush is really nice because it gives you that leaf texture right off the bat. Another one of my favorite ways to create kind of like a water texture, because there's so many different ways to do that. I was just playing around with the wet blender. I laid down a little bit of blue and then a little bit of a lighter teal blue, and then I just went in and started to use that blender. It's picking up that white because I have white left around that. If I made a new layer and say I added just I'm going to go purple here, put a purple next to it, what would happen? I would have just a nice space there. There we go. And I used that blender tool. It's not going to smudge it with that teal unless I was working in that teal layer. The only reason it looks like it's smudging with it is because that blue is underneath. So if I make that disappear, kind of that white, that transparent was blending with it. So the smudge tool I was using helped build up that water. If I wanted to create a roughness, I'm just going to go in with the Impressionist blender, and this is how I can take something and just make it look really rough. This would maybe be nice for like a rock or maybe some sort of rough detail on like an article of clothing. It's really up to how you lay it down. But on the desktop version, just an important thing, and I'm going to review it one more time here, but using a base color. So if I have a green here and then a little bit of a different green and then another green, using that smudge tool or a mixer brush tool to bring in some of the different ways to blend that color is also going to help you give that texture in there as well too. So my computer is processing this very slowly because they're building up all those details here. I'd say this brush too would be really nice for making water. So when you play around like I have here, I just have a bunch of tests. I'm just working in a test document to try out some different brushes and how I could build them out and get some really, really cool visual implied textures in my work. So that is it for textures. For those who are still watching this video, one cool thing that you can test out is building up and creating effects using different layers. And this is something that I did in the iPad. I found a tutorial on Pinterest, and it started with building a just base watercolor, which I applied accidentally onto my background. Then I blended that a little bit together using a blending brush. Then I applied the waves in their own layer. So if I use the move tool, I can move them around and decide where I want it to be. I'm just going to go back because that's how I had it. Then I made a copy of that layer and just moved it slightly off to the side to create that reflection, and then changed the opacity level of it so it is more transparent. And then I made another copy of that, made it transparent, and just changed up a little bit to kind of create this water effect. So this can be done in both the desktop and the iPad version. The trick here for creating this water is just building up the layers. If you want to try out some different tutorials and steps for creating different effects in Photoshop, I totally recommend looking at Pinterest. There's a lot of really great little tutorials on like how to create some different effects that you could totally bring into your fantasy landscape for this unit. Thanks for sticking around for my texture video. I hope that you learned some cool little tricks for testing out textures on Adobe Photoshop. As a reminder, totally make a document where you can just try out these different textures. Have fun and enjoy!